super excited to be here at my first Liberal convention. Feeling the energy in the room, watching a whole 5,000 people that are here that want to build Canada strong.
Build Canada strong? She picked up that Liberal catchphrase pretty quickly, eh? That was Marilyn Gladu on her first full day as one of Mark Carney's MPs after more than a decade of being elected as a Conservative.
This is actually the best thing for my riding, for the country, and for myself.
I'm Catherine Cullen, and this week on The House, we've got the floor crosser who started it all, Chris D'Entremont, and the Liberal MP who first approached him. What do you say to an MP to convince them to leave their political party and join yours? We're going to find out. Now, Marilyn Gladu is likely the most socially conservative MP yet to make this leap. Can Mark Carney keep together a Liberal tent with so many different views? And how big a problem is Pierre Poilievre's shrinking caucus? Our journalist panel tells us what they're hearing. Plus, is protecting CanCon worth a battle with the Trump administration? Why the U.S. is so unhappy with one particular Canadian law? We're going to look at whether it is worth the fight. But let's kick things off with a behind-the-scenes look at how to win over a floor crosser. The House is now in session. Rumors of more floor crossers continue to swirl. Asked by a journalist what to expect, Prime Minister Mark Carney responded with a bit of a smile.
You know, I'm often the last to know. Not quite the last to know because there's an announcement, but I will tell you in all seriousness, what has been the case is in each of these circumstances is that the individuals have come to people they know well in the Liberal caucus and expressed an interest in joining.
But what do those conversations really sound like? On Friday afternoon, I decided to ask the original Conservative floor crosser, Chris D'Entremont, and a Liberal MP who helped convert him, fellow Nova Scotian Cody Blois, Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister. You are both in Montreal right now for the Liberal convention. Gentlemen, thank you for making the time and joining me.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Catherine.
Chris, I want to start with you. The first conversation you had about floor crossing was with Cody. Describe to me the moment where you think, hey, is this guy trying to get me to change teams?
Well, I think the discussion over the last couple of years really is that, Chris, you're in the wrong place. Anytime you want to talk, come on over. And Cody and I have always had a really good relationship. We're neighbors. We represent some of the same areas, some of the same people in a lot of cases. And, after the election and when I saw things not changing, I said, I'd really like to have a chat with you. And Cody, of course, was more than happy to oblige.
Cody, do you remember the moment where you thought, wait a minute, is this working?
I remember it well, and Chris is right in the fact that we would, of course, joke and chide over a number of years, saying at the end of the day, look, Chris has served as a progressive Conservative at the provincial legislature level. His interventions in the House were reflective of I think a centrist type of conservatism. And when you see a way in which the Prime Minister was governing, particularly after our mandate that we were granted in April, Chris and I have just remained in touch. And it really started at a lunch, I believe, Chris, in August in Shooters. You were on your way back from Newfoundland. I said, let's get together. And we had a conversation. Of course, it wasn't a high pressure pitch, Catherine. It was just reiterating to Chris that I think he would find a lot of relevance with our party and the way in which the Prime Minister was governing, and that he would be welcome as a part of the family and that we could do a lot of good work together.
Chris, you must remember that lunch. Was that a moment where things started to change for you?
Yeah, no, for sure. Because we did have those frank discussions about it. I mean, I had just come, like I said, I just come back from Newfoundland, talking to some folks over there as well. But
can I ask, when you were in Newfoundland, were you with Pierre Poilievre at the time?
No, actually, I wasn't. But I was meeting with the MP over there and doing a bit tour with Jonathan Rowe. So
okay.
Definitely playing the part of a Conservative MP.
Right on. Okay, so you come from that conversation. You have this lunch with Cody Blois. Is there anything that he said at that lunch that really stood out in your mind? You thought, it's time to give this some more thought.
No, I don't think so. I think, that things haven't necessarily changed. I think I was probably thinking in that direction as well. It probably solidified some of the thoughts that I've been having. But then that was like in August. And then we went back in the house in September. We walked through October, and then other people are starting to talk to you as well, with the occasional Cody saying, hey, how you doing?
As Cody mentioned, I mean, you were a conservative provincially. I believe 2003 you started serving in elective
Yep,
politics.
2003.
Yeah, did you, especially over those months, August, September, October, November, are you struggling with this at that point? What's going through your mind?
Yeah, no, definitely struggling. I mean, I was always a progressive conservative. I was able to be a minister of health and then talk about progressive things that are important to Nova Scotians. I always didn't stray very far from the middle when it came to my politics. And over time, and what I was seeing with this new crop of conservative MPs, I felt we had moved way too far to the right.
So, Cody, people should remember that now we've seen all these floor crossers. At the time, this had not happened. So for you, what did you try to do to close the deal?
Well, look, I want to be very clear, and the Prime Minister and then the remarks that you played, Catherine, I think really calls it the way it is. This has happened organically, having members of Parliament identify themselves, or because of the relationships that many Liberal MPs have across various different channels. And so, I think it's important to remember, and I'll go on record saying this: if it were not for Chris D'Entremont, the person, we would have won that seat in Acadianapolis. Ronnie LeBlanc was a great candidate. Chris won because Chris D'Entremont is so well respected in his riding. And, for us, when I look at Chris, here's someone who knows the fishery very well. And of course, those are issues extremely important in Atlantic Canada. Chris and I had done previous work on 14 Wing Greenwood, where we've seen great investments in the defense community. So for me, of course, I wanted to have that conversation. We almost went 11-11 in the election. He's a moderate
11-11, you mean winning all 11 seats in Nova Scotia for the
we
Liberal
almost
Party.
won. That's right,
If
Catherine.
it weren't for that pesky Chris D'Entremont.
That pesky Chris D'Entremont 2019, and again.
That's right. And so, for us, Catherine, it was, why not have the conversation? I've openly said on the floor of the House of Commons, I identify as a blue Liberal, an economic side of the party, and what Mark Carney is in his leadership, he's brought the Liberal Party back to the center. That has allowed MPs like Chris, like Michael Ma, like Matt Generou and others to say, well, this is a vehicle that I think represents my values, my ideology, and my community. And I think we were just so happy to get it started with Chris.
So, Chris, we're going to fast forward a bit through this back and forth over the fall. Eventually, you get into the room with the Prime Minister, right? Someone invites you to go meet with him. Can you put me in your shoes in that meeting?
Well, even back it up by just a few hours, where I get to talk to Wayne Long. Wayne was another one of the folks that have been trying to push me forward.
New Brunswick MP.
Yeah, exactly. And he actually set up the meeting with the Prime Minister, and basically I get a phone call in about 45 minutes where I had to get over to the Prime Minister's office to meet with him. And the discussion I was having with my wife at the time is like, I think I'm going to do this. I want to see how Mr. Carney is, how the Prime Minister is, get a better feeling of what his vision is. I see what he's doing in the media, but I don't know him as a person. I haven't met him. And, within 45 minutes, I was in his office having a chat with him. And, the first thing that he brings up, not the selling point, but definitely understanding the people of Southwest Nova Scotia, understanding what the things that I find important are, was that he talked about the money invested in the 15th of August, the National Day for Acadians, on the investment that they were going to do there. So he started off with a heart, with something that's so important to me, but then talked about the economy, talked about what things were important, what Nova Scotia meant to him. We had a wonderful conversation over almost an hour. And to think I could sit there with the Prime Minister and talk about those things and be so frank was absolutely phenomenal.
So that was what made the deal?
That was the clincher. There was the clincher.
Let me ask you, the Prime Minister said this week he had discussions with Marilyn Gladu, as others did as well, on issues that include abortion, and that she's going to vote with the government on those issues now. Was there a conversation you had to have about any position you take, be it, social or otherwise, about whether or not you were willing to toe the Liberal line?
No, not really. No. We did those issues didn't come up. I think over time, I have been very clear that I find it a women's right to choose is extremely important. So, there was nothing unknown on that side of things. So, I've always qualified myself as that red Tory, and none of those discussions ever came up.
Do you call yourself a blue liberal now or what?
I still call myself, somehow I'm still a progressive conservative sometimes. So it's kind of funny.
I don't know how that would go over in Montreal.
I don't know. But here I am at a liberal conference, with 4,500 other people. And I'm having a great time taking selfies and chatting with people. But I don't know how to sell it, whether I'm a recovering conservative or whether I was a liberal all along and I just didn't know it.
Cody, I'm having a laugh here, but some Canadians really do not like floor crossing. They think that it doesn't respect voters. How do you justify to them what we just talked about?
Well, I think it's important, and many Canadians, when we talk about our electoral system, they'll say, well, I voted for Mr. Poilievre, or I voted for Mr. Carney, or, it was Jagmeet Singh at the time. Ultimately, you vote for an individual candidate in your riding. And yes, I appreciate, Catherine, that yes, we have party affiliations, but members of parliament ultimately have the ability to identify. It is their job to bring the interests of their community forward. And so whether it's Chris, whether it's Marilyn or Laurie Idlu or others who have made this decision, they have to identify both in terms of what they stand for as representatives, but also what they believe is in the best interest of the people that they represent. Because when you come to Ottawa, Catherine, I don't just represent, in the last case, the 61% of people that voted Liberal in King's Hands. I represent the 39% of people who don't as well. And so there is an obligation as a member of parliament when you step into that ring, into that arena, that you are always constantly identifying how best to represent your constituents. And that's a choice that has to be made for those who make those decisions. And at the end of the day, come the next election, people will have the ability to demonstrate if they believe that was in the interest of the community or not. And that'll be for each MP, whether you've crossed the floor or not, to demonstrate that you're still the best person and representative for your area.
Chris, on that note, Pierre Poilievre said this week, these kinds of floor crossings mean you are looking voters in the eye in an election, and then you don't honor your word. I know it was close in your riding last election, but I wonder whether you struggled with the fact that surely some of the people who voted for you in the last election saw what you did crossing the floor as a betrayal.
Oh, no, absolutely. And, I still have the opportunity to talk to them, still reaching out to them. They reach out to me. I know they're still unhappy, but the far majority of people are happy with that, with the decision, as long as I can deliver. So it really means that over the next bit, but that we need to have more announcements like we've had in Greenwood and some more things around the fishery that we just need to deliver. We as politicians, as MPs, really want to deliver for our communities. And I think ultimately it doesn't matter which party you belong to. At the end of the day, you're there for them.
But this is a tricky line, Chris, because if people hear, well, becoming a liberal means you're going to get more money in your community, I mean, that's not really how it's supposed to work, right?
No, not at all. But we as politicians want to get here and get things done. And the current way that the House works is it doesn't allow us to get a whole lot done. That it would be better if we were all a little more independent and allow us to do our jobs rather than bring us down into these political games that keep getting played in the House of Commons.
Cody Blois, we just got a second left. CBC has been saying potentially 9 more floor crossers out there. You become a recruiting agent, sir? You involved in any more recruitments?
Yeah, look, at the end of the day, Catherine, I go back to what the Prime Minister said yesterday, which is these are organic conversations. Of course, I've had conversations. There's many others. Chris just mentioned Wayne Long, that we saw Evan Solomon standing with Marilyn Gladu the other day. There is a lot of different relationships that we have as members of parliament. So anyone who's in this game is respectfully not going to raise that on this program. But yeah, of course, I think there's conversations being had amongst the many members of parliament. And obviously on the other side, whether it's in the NDP camp or in the Conservative camp, people are identifying with the way in which this government and the Prime Minister is conducting himself.
But also, if you have lunch with Cody Blois, you never know where it's going to lead.
especially at shooters.
Listen, gentlemen, I really appreciate you both taking the time to talk to us today. Thank you.
Thanks, Catherine.
Thanks so much.
Liberal MPs, both Nova Scotians, Chris D'Entremont and Cody Blois. You know who isn't as keen on floor crossing? Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre.
If you ran in an election, you went out and you said to little old ladies, to veterans, to truckers, to single moms that you were going to stand up for the conservative platform of affordability, safety, and national sovereignty, and to do so as part of the Conservative Party that people voted for, then you should respect those people and honor your word. Mark Carney is saying is that your vote doesn't count, that he's going to use backroom dirty deals to reverse the election result in countless ridings, robbing people of their voice and giving him the power to raise your cost of living. That is wrong. He should respect the democratic will of the Canadian people.
Poilievre is angry, but so are at least a few Liberals who are concerned Marilyn Gladu might make an awkward fit for the party. What's the worry? Here to break it down for us, Joël Denis Belvance is the Ottawa Bureau Chief for La Presse, Nick Taylor-Vasey is the Ottawa Bureau Chief for Politico, and he's in Montreal for the Liberal Convention. Welcome to the House.
Good to see you.
Thanks for having me.
JD, I'm going to start with you. So for folks who don't know, Marilyn Gladu, when she was a Conservative, pro-trucker convoy, she had to apologize for comments she made during COVID. Her past voting record suggests she might be offside with the Liberals on abortion and conversion therapy, but she now says she has agreed to uphold Liberal values. Let's listen.
So for people in Canada, I have been consistent when I said that women need to have the right to choose. I obviously have my long faith traditions, but I'm ready to support the rights of women in this country. Next question.
Next question, JD. Is there a problem here or not for the Liberals?
I don't think so, for the following reason. I've been covering Parliament Hill for the last 30 years or so, and I remember a time when Jean Chrétien was leader of the Liberal Party, and that party had some social conservatives, Liberals, within the Chrétien government, and they were very, happy with the way the government was handling the economy, the fight against the deficit, reducing taxes back then when Jean Chrétien was Prime Minister. And in my sense, Mr. Carney is trying to reconstruct the Liberal Party to the image of what it was when Jean Chrétien was Prime Minister. That's what he's doing, attracting right-leaning MPs who happen to be elected under the Conservative banner, but now feel more comfortable because the economy is the focus of the Liberal government. They feel more comfortable under Mark Carney's government.
Nick, it is obvious, though, that her choice is making at least some Liberals uncomfortable. Former senior Trudeau staffer, Supriya Dwivedi, was posting online, quote, "Guys, maybe we should all reread values. It's possible we all missed the part where Carney said we don't need to actually have any." Ouch. I'm wondering, Nick, what are the conversations like in Montreal at the Liberal convention about this? Are you picking up on some of that discomfort, some of that shade?
Well, welcome to Carney Palooza, first of all, where Liberals are doing their victory lap, their extended victory lap a year after that stunning election win. But yeah, peppered into the conversations in the corridors are some of that awkwardness. JD stole the words right out of my mouth. There are Martin and Chrétien Liberals all over the place who are saying this is the natural order of things. This was the Liberal Party I grew up in back in the 80s and 90s and even into the 2000s. But then you do have particularly younger Trudeau-era Liberals, people who were maybe 18 or 19 years old or even older than that in 2015 when Trudeau came to power. And they're going through a bit of a reckoning. And let me tell you, there was all of these, their bars and receptions and hospitality suites. The first night of the convention, I think, was a lot of Liberals talking to a lot of Liberals about what the party used to be and what it was more recently, and then now what it's becoming. And these are not easy conversations for everybody, but there's certainly, it's a weekend full of evolution, let's say.
JD, this is fascinating to me because I think whenever there's a leadership race in a party, we go, well, is the party going to do some soul searching? And here Nick is describing it happening at the bar.
At the bar, yeah.
When they're about to form a majority government. It's a very different scenario. But I do wonder, we keep hearing this idea, has Mark Carney made the tent too big? Because he's brought people over from the NDP, and then he has this person who ran for the Conservative leadership. Help us understand, what could the potential problem be there? What does it mean to have a tent that's too big? What's the worry?
That's a good question. And I think Mr. Carney can face that question if he develops some caucus loyalty. That's going to be a critical point going forward, so that everybody buys into the kind of Liberal Party he's trying to build to attract people who were elected under a different banner. But Mr. Carney is also attracting people like Laurie Udlaut, an NDP MP who was elected under the NDP banner, who crossed the floor last March to join the Liberals. And so it's a big tent party. That's what it is. And there's, I think, one common denominator to it is that because Mr. Carney wants to focus mostly his energy on trying to rebuild the Canadian economy in a less dependent fashion towards the United States, trying to diversify trade with other countries than the United States, and we're at a critical moment. People are not focusing on social issues right now. They're focusing on bread and butter issues, and Mr. Carney is responding to that in a way that is attracting even conservative MPs who were elected last election.
I want to talk more about the Conservatives in a second, but Nick, I do want you to give us a bit more of that backroom energy from the Liberal convention, this possibility of more floor crossers, the likelihood of a Liberal majority. What are people saying to you about that?
All the talk here is about how many floor crossers there will be. It's not even a matter of if. It sounds like, is it going to be one today? Is it going to be two today? Are they going to wait until after these pivotal by-elections so that they can turn a slim majority government into a majority government with a little more breathing room? And I mean, if the question is the universe of potential conservative floor crossers widening? The answer is an emphatic yes. I mean, Marilyn Gladu has, I think, opened a lot of Liberal minds to a different sort of conservative. We, as journalists, for the last few months, we've been looking at conservatives who won with tight margins in the last election, conservatives who don't have a long history with the party, conservatives who are centrists, who maybe could look natural in a version of the Liberal Party that we've come to know over the last decade. Marilyn Gladu kind of blows that out of the water. She is a conservative who, it's, I think, fair to say, important to say, she's pitching herself as a moderate, a sort of conservative liberal here. She scrummed at the convention and said she's always been pro-choice. She actually has always opposed conversion therapy and, in fact, only voted against a bill to ban it because of freedom of expression or issues, freedom of religion issues in there. But yeah, I mean, she's a conservative's conservative. So the hallway chatter.
Well, now
is
she's
really
a liberal's
about,
conservative.
Well, yeah, and the hallway chatter is like, who, if her, I mean, then who else?
Well, so JD, I want to bring you in on this because the question this week has been that, but it's been all about the Liberals. Wow, who else could come into the tent? You have to flip it on its head too and say, if you are Pierre Poilievre, did he realize this week that if somebody as conservative-minded as Marilyn Gladu can go, anybody could be walking out the door?
Absolutely, and that's a very good question to ask. And we focus a lot about the consequences of having floor crossers going to the Liberals, but what are the consequences on Pierre Poilievre's leadership as a whole? I think it brings a lot of questions. That's the fourth MP leaving the caucus in 6 months. That must be saying something about the style of leadership that Mr. Poilievre is bringing to the game. And will he be able to stop this? I know for a fact that he made several calls after the announcement of Madame Gladu's departure, and even reach out to some of the people who have been on my list of potential floor crossers, trying to tell him what are your intentions. And he got some reassurance, but until what time this will hold. I think Madame Gladu leaving is the signal that anything can happen from now on under Mr. Poilievre's leadership, and then more MPs can cross. I wouldn't rule out somebody from Saskatchewan, for example. Why? Woo! Why? Because Mr. Carney has used provincial diplomacy to attract more support. Here's the example. When he traveled to India and China, who did he bring along?
I saw Scott Moe on that plane.
Exactly. What did Scott Moe brought home? Access again to the canola market in China and a big 2.6 billion deal in India to buy uranium in Saskatchewan. Mr. Moe is the happiest premier in Canada right now because of Mark Carney. Will that convince conservative MPs from Saskatchewan that Mr. Carney might be worth a second look? The question is open.
Nick, is there anything Pierre Poilievre can do about this to try to stop the bleeding?
Well, I think we all thought he did just do something to stop the bleeding. He returned from both a trip to Europe, where he visited the United Kingdom and Germany, and then he took a trip to the United States that most of his critics were calling on him to do for years, and he seemed to have cleared the bar almost in every way. He spent 2.5 hours with Joe Rogan and came out unscathed, came home, I think, sort of like passing with flying colors if you asked around Ottawa. And yet, the polling hasn't changed, and he's still bleeding MPs. It must be I mean, I think every day, if you talk to somebody in any opposition leader's office, they'll say any day is a frustrating day when you're not in government, but these have to be some of the most frustrating ones yet.
And knowing that majority government is on the horizon. We will be talking about, we're out of time now, we'll be talking about that next week on the show, I believe, because we have those two big by-elections, and we'll hear more about that in a moment. But right now, I want to thank you both for your time today. Joël Denis Bellevance of La Presse and Politico's Nick Taylor-Vasey. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So what's going to happen on those big by-elections Monday night? Pollster Philippe Fournier will give us his take in just a moment. I'm Catherine Cullen. You are listening to The House, making politics make sense. If you like the show, and we hope that you do, make sure that you follow us, leave us a review, or you can get in touch directly. We're at thehouse@cbc.ca. As we hold our breath to see if there's another floor crosser, we're also carefully watching the 3 by-elections that will take place on Monday. Those could officially give Mark Carney a majority government. 2 in Toronto are considered safe Liberal seats. But there's the riding of Terrebonne, a suburb of Montreal, where the Liberals won by just 1 vote last spring. Those results were overturned by the Supreme Court after it was revealed at least 1 voter was unable to have their vote counted because of an Elections Canada error. So, which way will the riding go this time? And what else do the numbers tell us about this wild political moment? Philippe Fournier is the editor-in-chief at 338 Canada. Welcome back to the House.
Bonjour, Catherine. Thanks for having me.
It's great to be talking to you, Philippe, and about Terrebonne, which is, such a, the essence of a nail biter, coming down to 1 vote last time before it was overturned. How close do you think it could be on Monday night?
Well, the real answer, Catherine, is we do not know. Because in a by-election, there are such local events, local factors that can influence the outcome, and that can be blind spots for us who are trying to feel the landscape. What I can tell you is that right now, Mark Carney and the federal Liberals are doing very well in Quebec in the polls. Mark Carney's personal numbers are up. The voting intentions show a big lead for the Liberals. But, as I just said, in a local election, especially, Catherine, in a riding that's not natural for the Liberals. Terrebonne is not supposed to go to the Liberals, and the Bloc Québécois, we know that they will put a hell of a fight to win back this riding.
Well, in fact, they have been putting a hell of a fight, as you put it, but the Liberals too, right? Like Yves-François Blanchet has been there a lot. The Liberals have sent some high-profile cabinet ministers in there. I wonder who you think has more to lose, the Liberals or the Bloc Québécois?
Well, I mean, in the numbers right now, and that's not just in Quebec, but from coast to coast, we see that the Liberals and Mark Carney enjoy some favorable momentum. As I said, the approval numbers are high, the voting intentions is high, even in provinces where we don't expect it, such as the Prairie provinces and Alberta. And a defeat in Terrebonne, I think, would feel like a first crack in the foundation. It would just shatter this momentum. So it would not be the end of the world for Mark Carney and the Liberals, but considering the floor crossing that has happened in past months, I think winning Terrebonne would give additional legitimacy to the process and Mark Carney's very slim majority in the House of Commons.
This is a particularly tricky one, given what you said a moment ago about how we just don't know the many things that feed into this. But I wonder, I mean, the Bloc Québécois were able to make this argument, give us the riding, people of Terrebonne, choose us, and you will deprive Mark Carney of all the power that he wants. The floor crossings are taking that argument away from him. Do you think it could have an effect on the results?
Perhaps. I mean, I do not want to overstate how much the median and regular voter puts attention to this. But it has been difficult for the Bloc Québécois to make that case because in a normal election, Yves-François Blanchet would say, we will stand in the way of a Liberal majority. The problem is, the polling shows that in Quebec, a lot of people kind of want Mark Carney to get this majority. And so they have to tread water and be very careful in their messaging, say that they will defend Quebec interest and work with the Liberals in a minority situation, not just let Mark Carney have all the power, as you just said.
Now, this has to be a weekend, Philippe, that makes your politics-loving heart just beat so fast because it is not just all this drama around floor crossings and the Liberal convention also happening this weekend. The CAQ, the Coalition Avenir Québec, will choose a new leader, and that person will become the Premier of Quebec. And, of course, there is an election in
That's
the
right.
province of Quebec. And we've talked about it on the show because, in particular, just a few months ago, it looked like the Parti québécois were headed to a win. That means we were expecting a referendum on sovereignty. So for folks in the rest of the country who haven't been following Quebec politics so closely, what do they need to know about where things stand now?
Well, they need to know that the CAQ, which won a massive majority of the National Assembly in 2022, is on a complete verge of collapse. In the polls, we had seen first the CAQ trailing the Parti québécois, then going down to third place behind the Liberals, then going down to fourth place behind the Quebec Conservatives, who have no seat in the National Assembly right now. And now, when you look at the numbers, we see a possible complete collapse, a complete wipeout of the electoral map. And so this new premier that Quebec will have, some have joked that it's a summer job. It will last 6 months. But the way things have gone in recent years in Canadian politics, especially in Quebec, I don't think we can take voters for granted. And the Parti québécois, as you mentioned, has been leading in the polls in Quebec since fall of 2023. And just last month, 2 polls back-to-back showed that the Quebec Liberals, who had really poor results 4 years ago, well, they are back with new leader Charles Milliard, and we may be in a tight race, something that we did not expect even 6 months ago.
Do you think there's any spillover effect from federal politics, that Mark Carney has any effect on all of this?
Well, it's possible, but unlike other provinces, and in Quebec, we see a real difference between the Quebec Liberals and the federal Liberals. Just to give you an idea, we just talked a minute ago about Terrebonne, which was won by the federal Liberals last April. Well, last March in 2025, there was a by-election in the provincial riding of Terrebonne, and the Quebec Liberals were in single digits. So I think most voters in Quebec really know the difference between the Quebec Liberals and the federal Liberals. There's not that much spillover.
Going back to this question of floor crossers, Marilyn Gladue, latest opposition MP to make a jump to the Liberals, her riding is in southwestern Ontario. What does the terrain look like for the Liberals in that area right now? Because her riding's been conservative for a while.
It's been conservative for a while. I checked the last time this area was Liberal was Paul Martin, who had won it in his minority in 2004. So it has been a while. I'm puzzled by this, Catherine, because the other floor crossers, we looked at the numbers and the projections. Those ridings, Acadie-Annapolis, Markham-Unionville, Nunavut, and Edmonton Riverbend, if an election was held this spring, the Liberals would be competitive and could win potentially those ridings. But Sarnia-Lambton, the riding of Ms. Gladue, right now is not favorable to the Liberals, unless there's something that we don't know. Maybe there's local data that has not been published, but we don't forecast it as being a Liberal seat. And so for Ms. Gladue, you wonder what motivated this. It surely was not because her riding was about to flip Liberal. There will be some questions about this in the next few weeks, I believe.
What about where Pierre Poilievre is left in all of this? Like, I take your point about her riding specifically. A lot of the conversation about the damage done to Pierre Poilievre has to do with the politics inside Conservative caucus. But what about where he stands on the national stage?
Well, the polls have not been favorable for the Conservatives since January. We talked a lot in the media about the Davos speech from Mr. Carney. It did have some effect, but it was in the following weeks that we really saw the Liberals jump up in popularity, including Mr. Carney. And for Pierre Poilievre, his personal numbers are still largely negative in most regions of the country, in key areas where the Conservatives need to do better to have a shot at the next election. Ontario, British Columbia, even in Quebec. And so for Pierre Poilievre, losing a fourth MP, and there may be more, cannot be seen as good news. Now, given that it looks like the Liberals will have their majority shortly, perhaps it gives a more runway for Pierre Poilievre to readjust his message, but it cannot be seen as good news when you lose MPs in that fashion.
Okay, as we said, big political weekend for you, Philippe. Remember to hydrate, pace yourself, don't overdo it, and have some fun.
Merci beaucoup, Catherine. Thanks for having me.
Merci à vous. Philippe Fournier of 338 Canada.
We want to resolve as much as we can. We've worked really closely with the Mexicans over the past year. They've resolved a lot of issues. The Canadians, we have some issues with them that haven't been resolved yet. So I think that we aren't probably going to be able to resolve all issues by July 1st, but I think we are on track to resolve many of them and to move as quickly as we can.
This week, U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer said Canada-U.S. trade negotiations could stretch past the July 1st deadline, leading to more potential uncertainty for Canada's economy. On his list of irritants is Canada's Online Streaming Act. It forces big streaming companies like Netflix and Disney to pay some of the money they make in Canada into funding for Canadian film, TV, and music. It's sometimes referred to as the Netflix tax. But is it worth fighting for it if it messes up the broader trade talks with the U.S.? The House's senior producer, Jennifer Chevalier, breaks it down.
I was going to ask you, Hollander, will you come to my cottage this summer?
A TV sensation that gave new meaning to a very Canadian phrase.
What the? I'm coming to the cottage.
Most people who watch the queer hockey romance Heated Rivalry probably weren't thinking about where the show's funding came from. But some think about that all the time.
Let's take the example of one of the biggest shows on the planet, Heated Rivalry. As the creators of that show have said publicly many times, that's a show that only could have been made in Canada.
Reynolds Maston is the president and CEO of the Canadian Media Producers Association. He thinks a lot about the Canada Media Fund. It's a pot of money that helped bankroll not just Heated Rivalry, but other shows like Schitt's Creek, North of North, and the French-language production Empathie. Traditional broadcasters pay into the fund, but it's been dwindling.
As people cut the cable cord and consume all of their content via the internet and wireless, those contributions to the Canada Media Fund will just continue to decline. Everyone sees that as inevitable. It's been going on for years. So that's going to put ever greater pressure on the system. And ultimately what it will mean is fewer Canadian shows.
That's something children's TV producer Carla de Jong has seen firsthand.
There's less doors for us to knock on. You know, the channels, Family Channel and Family Junior closed last year. We don't have the doors we did at Chorus anymore with Treehouse and YTV. That pool of people that and platforms that can help fund Canadian content for kids is becoming smaller and smaller and smaller.
De Jong has been commissioning children's television and making kids' TV in Canada for 15 years. She worries about the future of an industry that she says is important because it plays a big part in projecting Canadian values worldwide.
You know, kids seeing themselves and Canadian values being represented in television and in storytelling is something that we have been, that parents have been speaking to their kids about even before television was invented. Like, storytelling is how we teach values. And I love the example of Degrassi, which is a wonderful Canadian series and very intrinsically Canadian. When you watch that show, you know it's a Canadian series. And, I can speak to that very clearly because I grew up in Australia, but I still watched Degrassi. That Canadian series was, on our public broadcaster, and it showed me as an Australian teenager what it meant to be a Canadian teenager. And that really, helped me understand what the values were of being Canadian.
The federal government's been thinking about the problem of declining revenue for years, pretty much since online streaming of music and video took off. And so 3 years ago, after years of debate, the Online Streaming Act came into effect. Now big streamers like Netflix and Disney are supposed to pay 5% of their Canadian revenue into one of these pots of money to fund Canadian content. Local news, film, television, including shows you see on CBC, and Canadian music. Former NDP MP Andrew Cash is the president and CEO of the Canadian Independent Music Association. He says traditional CanCon funding has been vital to creating a vibrant Canadian music industry, and he believes that can likely only continue if online music streamers like Spotify keep paying into the system through two music funds called Factor and Musique Action.
There's really not a single musician that has not been impacted and affected directly or indirectly from the things that have flowed from CanCon, particularly the actual investments in Canadian artists and Canadian-owned companies through Factor and Music Action. The question really is, do we want to own our own cultural sector or not? And C11, the Online Streaming Act, is one way of answering part of that question.
But when the new law came into effect, it was challenged in court, and any money collected from streamers is being held in reserve until the Court of Appeal's decision. Last month, there was a fresh challenge to the new law. A U.S. Republican congressman has introduced a bill to investigate the Online Streaming Act and possibly retaliate with tariffs.
I think the bill is one thing, and I would see it as more of as a political gesture.
Sandra Obey is a Liberal strategist who worked for Industry Minister Melanie Joly, including at Heritage. She argues the U.S. bill is a bit of a stunt to remind the public that Americans won't tolerate restrictions on their cultural exports. But stunt or not, the message that the U.S. does not like Canada's law still stands.
This is an irritant, and so that idea that they want to see, that the American administration wants to see movement on this is not a joke, this is serious.
Last year, when Mark Carney became Prime Minister, he scrapped Canada's digital services tax, another Trudeau-era law that was considered a trade irritant for the U.S. Vas Bednar is the managing director of the Canadian Shield Institute, a think tank focused on economic sovereignty. She wonders if that could happen again.
I think ever since we stepped back from the digital services tax that was going to be unilaterally imposed, people have been looking ahead to this levy and thinking that it's also going to be quickly contested, maybe something we give up. Maybe it's easier to give up because we hadn't already imposed it and weren't already collecting items.
But giving it up could mean that potential funding disappears too. And that's what worries children's TV producer Carla de Jong.
I think all producers are concerned about that. I mean, it was very encouraging when Bill C-11 passed, but really we need to make sure that, the actual practicalities of getting that into the marketplace are there. What the bill really does is it levels the playing field for everybody. It's just holding everybody accountable to the same standards that we hold our own broadcasters in Canada accountable to. So making sure that, big streamers and platforms that are making a lot of money out of Canadians are actually having to put a little bit back into the Canadian marketplace so that we're able to make great Canadian content that will also play on those streamers and be offered to our audiences.
That's not how the big streamers see it. The Motion Picture Association declined an interview, but said in a statement that the act disadvantages American companies and undermines competitiveness. Michael Geist agrees. He's a law professor at the University of Ottawa, where he holds the Canada Research Chair in Internet and E-commerce law.
When one looks at the data that points to the amount of spending that takes place on film and television production in Canada, it becomes immediately apparent that the streamers are amongst the largest spenders in Canada right now. They've been major contributors on productions in Canada, some of which would qualify as CanCon, others of which would not. The problem is if you own the production and you're not Canadian, then basically you're out. And so Netflix or Disney or whomever can create programming that seems Canadian in just about every way. Canadian story and Canadian director and Canadian actors and a Canadian set. So it has just about every aspect of Canada in there, but because Netflix owns it, it's not treated as Canadian for these regulatory purposes.
The current CanCon rules mean foreign companies can't access the Canada Media Fund and similar pots of money the way that Canadian production companies can, though those rules may change. Carla de Jong explains why having Canadian ownership is important to producers like her.
Netflix is a great partner and a lot of the streamers are great partners, but there's very different ways in which you can work with the streamers. And some of the content that I think you're speaking to is not technically qualified as Canadian content. A lot of that content is made in Canada and draws upon the wonderful Canadian tax credits, but it's not actually the IP that's owned by Canadian producers, which is incredibly important to Canadian producers because when things happen in the States, like the writers' strike and production completely stops, Canadian businesses are deeply directly affected by that because the content is controlled out of the US and not by the Canadian side.
Canada's not alone in trying to figure out how to protect our cultural industries in the face of big streaming services. France is at the forefront. Australia just passed a similar law. But could Canada reverse course or soften our law to smooth the wider trading relationship? Liberal strategist Sandra Obey again.
Certainly, they're looking at elements like, are there amendments that can be made? Are there things that might make the irritant less irritant? Certainly, they're looking at some flexes that they can make.
But Reynolds Maston of the industry body that represents Canadian media producers says Canada shouldn't waver.
The Online Streaming Act actually was a quintessentially Canadian compromise. The U.S. streamers and studios were very actively involved when that legislation was being developed. And a lot of thought was given to how do we modernize our system in a way that works for Canada and works for them. And the Online Streaming Act already reflects that compromise. So I am hard-pressed to see in that context when the Online Streaming Act was already the product of a political compromise, in part to reflect the concerns of U.S. interests and U.S. companies, how we could concede even more. And I think we should resist that temptation as a country to do that.
I think the Carney government and the Liberal platform were quite clear when it comes to, like protecting our identity and culture. And that would not go well, I think, for the Liberals if they were to cave in on this. In Quebec, it is super important, and Quebec has been an important platform for the Carney government. They would certainly not want to alienate the French electorate. Like culture it's the very instance, it's at the core of society. It's a matter of identity. So they cannot go against it. They would take a huge blow.
1, 2, 3, 4, tell me that you love me more. Sleepless long.
Under Canada's trade agreements, there is a cultural exemption that allows Canada to protect its sector, to treat American companies differently from Canadians. But it could come at a cost, says Michael Geist.
If you choose to exercise the cultural exception, if you essentially say, yeah, we recognize that this policy violates our obligations under the trade agreement, but we have negotiated that we have the right to do that. What's important to note is that the country that is affected, in this case, the United States, is within the agreement explicitly entitled to essentially retaliate against those measures to the same tune, and they can target whatever sector they like. Any part of the Canadian economy can be targeted as part of that retaliation.
Still, patriotism is running pretty high right now. Canadians might be willing to run that risk. That's Bednar again.
I think it is an important piece of legislation. It's going to be a very big test for us in these ongoing discussions with the Trump administration. We don't want to become like an algorithmic vassal state that only, receives what digital companies that aren't based here and that don't necessarily hold our values decide we're going to be able to pay for.
For The House, I'm Jennifer Chevalier.
Okay, that is it for us this week. Our crew on The House is Kristen Everson, Benjamin Lopez-Stephen, Theo Van Bussicum, and our senior producer is Jennifer Chevalier. Technical production by Miguel Plant. I am Catherine Cullen. Thank you so much for listening.